Welcome to Rebel Speak and Isaiah Meandering, and today we're just going through the ending of chapter 41 and chapter 42. So a bit of ground to cover, and God is dialoguing with the children of Israel who are out. They've been diffused. They're living under Babylonian authority, and profound loss of identity, loss of strength, deep sense of impotence, and who are we? And I'm just going to read and kind of chat through it. So here we go. He said, when the poor and needy search for water and there's none, that God has told them, as we were kind of in the middle of chapter 41 last Isaiah Meandering, that where there is this type of need, God shows up. And everyone will see this miracle and understand that it is Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, who did it. God's going to move in a manner that's going to show that God is for God's children, that God's identified deeply with Israel, and God is faithful in that identification. It wasn't temporary. It's complete. Now, moving to verse 21. Can your idols make such claims as these? So we're dealing with idols, and where trust goes, in whom do you trust? Let them come and show what they can do, says Yahweh, the King of Israel, or the King of Jacob, actually. So again, this is a version of scripture that's trying to make it easier by normalizing where different names are used, just using the same name Israel, not going back between Israel and Jacob, who is the same person, not wanting to cause that confusion to the reader. Let them try to tell us what happened. Okay, again, God's in a position. So the gods in the land of Babylon, they seem very powerful. They represent this nation. People put their trust in idols, and God's contrasting God's self with such idols. Let them try to tell us what happened long ago or what the future holds. Yes, that's it. If you are little g gods, tell what will occur in the days ahead. Or perform a mighty miracle that will fill us with amazement and fear. Do something, whether good or bad. This is God a little bit mocking these idols. But no, you are less than nothing and can do nothing at all. Anyone who chooses you becomes filthy just like you. You're out of the dirt. You're out of the earth. There's no aboveness in you. But God's speaking on God's behalf. God is in the midst of this relationship, and God's moving. I have stirred up a leader from the north and east. He will come against the nations and call on my name, and I will give him victory over kings and princes. He will trample them as a potter treads on clay. Okay, there's one being stirred up from the north and east. He will come against the nations and call on my name. And many think that this is referring to Abraham, and some think it's referring to Cyrus. And then others say it's really referring to both of them. That there was a way that Abraham was called, and he's been put in a position, and God's talking about that which has gone before and that which will come ahead, how God knows both the past and the future. And this is kind of a double entendre, that he will come against the nations and call on my name. Abraham was called and then, makes offerings and calls on God's name. And I will give him victory over kings and princes. He will trample them as a potter treads on clay. What does that mean? It means that these nations, these kings and princes, are of the earth. They're no different than a clay pot. They can posture as if they're so much. And I think it's something to think about the world stage right now, where things are positioned and postured as if they have tremendous power. And in the end, they are mere clay. They will return earth to earth. They will return. And the one called by God will return these things that posture themselves as far superior, these things that can't see, can't hear, can't speak. They're not God. They will be as simple as if you think about a terracotta clay pot, right? I'm going to say it's organic material. It will fully return to the earth. Who but I have told you this would happen? Who but I have professed this? Who else predicted this, making you admit that he was right? No one else said a word. I was the first to tell Jerusalem, look, help is on the way. Help is coming. Not one of your idols told you this. No one was expecting what's about to happen. No one saw it coming. God stands on God's own. And God's declaring that God stands on God's own here. Not one gave any answer when I asked. See, they are all foolish, worthless things. Your idols are all as empty as the wind. So God's contrasting that which is something to that which is nothing. No thing. Insubstantial, no substance. Okay. Look at my servant whom I strengthen. And so we're going to move into this vision of a servant. And I personally believe this is Israel, but it also then, of course, is the way, right, we can be reading at so many different levels. Isaiah is a book to be read at a variety of levels all at once. The whole of Scripture is to be read at a variety of levels all at once. It's so much the power and the beauty of it. So there's this immediacy of the situation, but there's also the truth of Jesus and the coming of the Christ, that while this is written, not imagined, right? Not who Jesus is and how Jesus is, it's not imagined. Look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one. Okay, one that will serve. And I am pleased with him. And those of us that know the New Testament know that this I am pleased with him is language that God speaks over Jesus. I have put my spirit upon him. He will reveal justice to the nations. He will be gentle. He will not shout or raise his voice in public. It's not going to be his volume that persuades. He will not crush those who are weak or quench the smallest hope. This is some of the most beautiful language in Scripture. This tenderness of the servant. I kind of have read it and was taught to read it as that being Israel. That there's a new call upon Israel, that we were told when God called Abraham, they were meant to be a blessing to the nations, and then so much of God's complaint in the prophetic, across the prophetic books, is that Israel's not what it's meant to be. It's not a blessing. It's as cruel and harsh as any other nation. There's no differentiation, and their identifying with God is just painful. But here is what God is saying about the servant that he's calling. He will reveal justice to the nations. That in and of itself is huge, because nations do not operate in justice. Selfishness, human selfishness. He will be gentle. He will not shout or raise his voice in public. He will not crush those who are weak. Just want to speak those words. Not crush those who are weak, or quench the smallest hope. Thinking of like a little fire that's trying to get lit. Just this little tiny amount, just enough, modicum, just enough hope trying to get, and it's so easy to crush. Hope at that moment in time is so easy to crush. And he says, I'm not, that won't be crushed. He will bring full justice to all who have been wronged. I want you just to hold that in your heart. Full justice to all who have been wronged. And I want to encourage you, as you're stepping out into life and you're frustrated and you see what you see, to know it's just not the end of the story. It is the prevailing story. It's not just like, oh, we know who wins in the end. No, there's this thing that we're told in the beginning of the Gospel of John, like hell can't put it out. And there's something about the way that the kingdom remains shining, that is a source of strength and should be strengthening us and reminding us of where it is going, and how it's pulling history. It's not just getting by the skin of its teeth. That's a weird expression. God's not barely getting by. God is working in and through history in amazing ways, in which or of which you and I partake. So to put some of these thoughts and declarations above a way that we've been taught to read reality that doesn't have God at the helm of history. that has God kind of barely getting by and fairly pathetic. No, indeed not. He will bring full justice to all who have been wronged. That is what God is about. He will not stop the servant, okay? And there's many angles and lens which to see this through. But there's this calling at this point in the book of Isaiah. There's a calling. There's a calling of one called servant. And the one called servant is so righteous. It's a fresh painting. It's actually taking an idea of righteousness and giving it more depth, filling out the lines, right? Filling out the color. He will not stop until truth and righteousness prevail throughout the earth. Even distant lands beyond the sea will wait for his instruction. God, Yahweh, created the heavens and stretched them out. He created the earth and everything in it. He gives breath and life to everyone in all the world. And it is he who said, here we go, quote, I, Yahweh, have called you to demonstrate my righteousness. I will guard and support you, for I have given you to my people as the personal confirmation of my covenant with them. And you will be a light to guide all nations to me. You will open the eyes of the blind and free the captives from prison. You will release those who sit in dark dungeons. It's so important that we hear this, that we know how the people heard this in the midst of Babylon being in control. This promise of righteousness to come and the completeness of which righteousness brings, the completeness of salvation, the kindness, the seeing, the eyes to see. Still in quotes, I am Yahweh, that is my name. I will not give my glory to anyone else. I will not share my praise with carved idols. Everything I prophesied has come true, and now I will prophesy again. I will tell you the future before it happens. This is just glorious, glorious proclamation. Glorious of where you and I are going in the midst of days that many adjectives, they're marked a bit by craziness. And in that craziness, hopelessness can creep in, and it's not meant to. And it's not just the power of positive thinking. It's clarity. It's clarity of God's own righteousness in the right arm. What does that mean? That means strength and righteousness married together. That God has imagined and is calling all of creation forward into a fullness of righteousness that will in the end, right? Will in the end be fully established. And here we are in the middle of the story of an essential moment of the storyline moving forward. Okay, however you're picturing it, just be aware that there's this moment that this scripture is speaking that's moving the idea of justice. It's moving the idea of righteousness. It's moving the idea of a servant. And we'll come to see that servant suffers as well. There's truth that's walking into the storyline right now. Truth. And it's beckoning. It's beckoning at us. It's beckoning throughout all time. Sing a new song for Yahweh. Sing his praises from the ends of the earth. Sing, all you who have sailed the seas, all you who live in distant coastlands. When you're sailing the seas, you're so vulnerable. That's the greatest power in many ways, the most vulnerable. I want to say it that way. At the heart of the sea, you're so very vulnerable. Distant coastlands, you're so far beyond the reach. This is declaring God's vastness over all of creation. Join in the chorus, you desert towns. Let the villages of Kedar rejoice. Let the people of Selah sing for joy. Shout praises from the mountaintops. Let the coastlands glorify Yahweh. Let them sing his praise. Yahweh will march forth like a mighty man. He will come out like a warrior, full of fury. God has strength. God has vindication in God's mind. He will shout his thundering battle cry, and he will crush all his enemies. You see enemies on the landscape? Enemies come to an end. God crushes them all. He will say, quote, I have long been silent. Yes, I have restrained myself But now I will give full vent to my fury. I will grasp and pant like a woman giving birth. That's very engaged. I just want to say that, as one who's given birth. That panting and grasping is the height, I know of no greater engagement. God says, there I am, as engaged, all about, consumed by, right? Nothing in that moment, nothing else is real nor matters. I will level the mountains and hills and bring a blight on all their greenery. I will turn the rivers into dry land and will dry up all the pools. Okay, we just saw dry land having rivers, and we just saw dry places becoming pools. And this is poetry, of course. It's a declaration of God's strength, and in some ways, God's capacity to take, right? To take from those that have prioritized themselves and see themselves as privileged and above. And God says, I can take from you as quickly as I can give to the one who doesn't have. I can take from you as quickly as I give to the one who doesn't have. I will lead blind Israel down a new path. There they are, and they are cynical, and what's the point? And God's like, I've got you, and I never dropped you. I will lead blind Israel down a new path. God's not requiring sight, by the way, guiding them along an unfamiliar way. I will make the darkness bright before them and smooth out the road ahead of them. They're despondent. They don't see a road. They don't see a path. Yes, I will indeed do these things. I will not forsake them. Your foreparents couldn't hear, didn't care. There's a resolve in God that has almost nothing to do with who the people are. The moment's here, and God's planned it all along. God's planned it all along. There's a completeness and a fullness and a goodness. Yes, I will indeed do these things. I will not forsake them. But those, contrast. You're looking at people and thinking they have so much as they trust in their idols. Have you ever had that? There's some Psalms that give witness. Like, I looked out, God, and it just looked like the folks without you were doing better. You're going to see why I'm God and why your history is so rich and so blessed. You're going to come to some new understanding and insight. But those who trust in idols, calling them their little g gods, they will be turned away in shame. Gods that have no life, aren't living, can do nothing. You've identified with these little g gods, these idols, in the midst of your strength and security. But when that strength and security is gone, when your pools are turned into desert, when there is no more life, those little g gods, idols, have no power and no life. Whereas my people are in a season of inadequacy, of not having. And I'm going to stand up in the midst of that. See, it's one thing to be having great luck and say, oh, I'm so thankful for our gods. We're in this amazing moment of good luck. It's another thing to be in a situation that is downtrodden and watch the real God, the God that created the universe, stand up and say, I've got you. Out of nothing, I'm bringing life to you. Oh, how deaf and blind you are towards me. Why won't you listen? Why do you refuse to see? Who in all the world is as blind as my own people? There they are. They have no hope. The storyline has, I don't know, they have no trust. They're despairing. And I don't know, you can read this different ways, but I see kind of a twinkle in God's eye. No, you thought this was, you thought that you'd been left to the hands of luck, right? How many of us really believe in luck? Like, no, that there's people for whom things work out and there's people for whom things fall apart. And God's like, nope. When you're on my side, when you're on my team, when you're the servant I've chosen to teach the world about righteousness and justice, Who in all the world is as blind as my own people, my servant? I have a plan for you, and it's fixed. It's fixed throughout eternity. It's fixed in the stars. It's fixed in the heavens. It's fixed. Who is as deaf as my messengers? Who is as blind as my chosen people, the servant of Yahweh? You see and understand what is right, but refuse to act on it. You hear, but you don't really listen. So there's something that you're aware of, but there's so much more you could know. There's so much more you could know because you know me. I just want to say that to you even where you are right now. Ask. There's so much more you can know because you know Yahweh, and he knows you. Counted those hairs on your head. Yahweh has magnified his law and made it truly glorious. Through it, he had planned to show the world that he is righteous. But what a sight his people are. There was a plan. I had a plan to show the world how righteous I am, and he still has that plan. But what a sight his people are, for they have been robbed. This is an amazing sentence. They have been robbed, enslaved, imprisoned, and trapped. They have, instead of running with the story that God had. Now here's the cool thing about God. Salvation. We miss it. We miss the opportunity. And God walks, he rewrites the storyline to get us back to where we're meant to be. But God's people were robbed, enslaved, imprisoned, and trapped. They are fair game for all and have no one to protect them. They got themselves into a situation where there was none to protect them. Will not even one of you apply these lessons from the past and see the ruin that awaits you? Who allowed Israel to be robbed and hurt? Was it not Yahweh? It was Yahweh whom we sinned against. For the people would not go where he sent them, nor would they obey his law. Well, none of you, and it's all of a sudden putting it in the first person plural. No one's being honest about why they're where they are. In their cynicism, they're not saying, no, we got here. Our rebellion got us here. Deceiving of ourselves. I guess that's what I want to say. Absolute dishonesty about God and who God was and what God had asked of us and what God had promised through righteousness and our choosing to be unrighteous, our foreparents. There's no connecting of history, no identifying with their history honestly. And all of a sudden the scripture jumps into this third person plural, we. It was Yahweh whom we sinned against, for the people would not go where he sent them, nor would they obey his law. See, he was sending them out of Jerusalem and they wouldn't go, and so Jerusalem really falls. It falls all the harder. They wouldn't obey his law. They didn't care what they looked like. They didn't care how they behaved and then treated God's name badly, identifying God's name with horrible, evil, vile behavior. That is why Yahweh poured out such fury on them and destroyed them in battle. They were set on fire and burned, but they still refused to understand. And now here we are way forward in history. And there they are under this diaspora in Babylon, in this where there is no temple, there is no Jerusalem, there is not even, what does glory days even mean to us? And there's no memory. There's no memory of how the storyline unfolded. There's no honesty. There's no truth in you. And then I'm just going to read a few verses, because I don't want to end here, because it doesn't end here. But now, O Israel, Yahweh who created you, called you, you would not exist, you would not be were it not for Yahweh. There would be no you. There was no you. When God spoke to Terah and then Abram and Sarai, who boldly and bravely went into this kind of reckless wild land and believed in a way that's accounted as faith. The Lord who created you, you exist because you were called. This is what that Yahweh says, do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. This is that language, this beautiful Old Testament language, familial language. That it's why so much was given to the eldest son. Because the eldest son, if life worked out well, would be able to walk into one of the siblings who became destabilized, a daughter that never married, and would be able to restore them where they might have to be sold into slavery. In the prophetic book of Hosea, he goes and restores his wife. There's ways that things happen and life falls apart, and a family member is to restore you. And God is identifying with that role in all its familiarity, family, relationalness. Do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. You are ransomed. You think you're in captivity, you're not. You're ransomed. You stand ransomed right now. I've called you by name. You are mine. There's this tenacity of relationship, but poignancy of relationship, determinedness of relationship. The love of God, if you are not feeling that tattooed in your heart, stamped in your soul, this is what this is the storyline that the cross pays for us to be a part of fully. This is the storyline to which we are indebted, I want to say. This is our storyline. The storyline of great passion of a God who's called you by name and says, no, you're mine. And nothing you can do. I'll deal with you. I'm going to deal with you not because I don't like you, because I want your ears to hear. I want your ears to hear, your heart to feel. I'm figuring this out. We're going to get you there. When you go through deep waters and great trouble, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. You think you're drowning. You think I'm irrelevant to your pain. You think the whole history of your storyline is irrelevant. You don't know. You're so lucky. You have the one relevant living God. All the other storylines are temporary. Kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall. But I, God, live on. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. You are, even yet, even now, you are. The flames will not consume you. Life goes on, and it's vibrant. Wow. For I am Yahweh, your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Think salvation. I gave Egypt, Ethiopia, and Seba as a ransom for your freedom. Others died that you might live. I traded their lives for yours because you are precious to me. All these powers that you think are greater than you, all these ways that you've determined yourself the least and the lowest and the worst off. Can you picture that? Where your children tell themselves a storyline about their family that has them having the least. And it's just not quite true. You are honored. This is ready? I'm going to close. This is verse 4. I'm going to pick up on this next Isaiah Meanderings. You are honored, and I love you. You thought your storyline was a storyline of dishonor, and you looked at the powers around you, and they just seemed like they had everything. And you somehow got in your mind, we're following the wrong God. We've gotten this just not even right. This whole situation and circumstance, it's so wrong. And God's like, no, I called you. There is no you. There's no you that I haven't spoken. And not only do you have, no, we have the worst, we have the worst God, or I don't want to be simplistic, but a sports team that has the dumbest mascot. Sorry. Sometimes I know I say things wrong. Other times, oh my goodness. But anyway, no, you don't. You've got the God that chose you. You've got the God that's not just on your side in spite of yourself. No, the one that actually honors you and loves you and has written this whole storyline for your salvation and to know the joy of being loved. And that's true today. We're in the midst of this huge history that comes to culmination. That word often eludes me. Culminates in God fully residing here on earth. Heaven on earth as it is in heaven. And you and I are in the midst of this culminating. And it culminates, it's culminating, right? You go from glory to glory, the New Testament tells us. We're in the midst of a culminating within our own life. And we walk in and we read this story of Isaiah where there's just lots of disappointment. And God's like, you don't even know. Kid, you don't even know. But wait and see and watch. Don't let the enemy put a cynical storyline in your soul. And then you look at life from that lens and there's so much you don't see. And in heaven you're going to be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh no, you didn't see. That's why the man hiding the talent, the money, it's money, is a problem. Because God's revealed God's heart in such a way that we're meant to see and know. You and I, God feels like, I think you should be able to see and know. I think you should see my goodness. And I want to encourage you that some of us have had really hard stories. And we're like, no, I don't know what salvation looks like. And it's easier to be cynical than to expect. But I want to speak expectation into your story. Because the cross is Christ dying on behalf of all that you trust in your cynicism. He's died for a new story. And I believe there's some of you that when you realized Christ had died for you, then you thought it was up to you to get the storyline right. And so you tried, and you really, now you're just comfortable with destruction. Like, no, that cross isn't quite big enough. But you didn't know how to give your life to Christ as a constant, as the one who has ransomed and set you free, as the one that's so deeply interested. I'm sorry, I'm so dyslexic, I am. Deeply interested in you, given intimately to you specifically, to me. God does that. And I want to encourage you to even surrender, like Hezekiah we saw a few chapters ago. Lay the letter that you've written, perhaps, that mocks God in your life. Sennacherib had written a letter. Lay the letter that you've written that holds God as failed. No, God, you're a failed storyline in my life. Lay it in the temple. Go to a place of worship. Invite God to speak and be expectant, because Hezekiah is expectant that God will answer. We can get so trapped in our cynicism that we don't know how to hear God because he doesn't speak that language. Invite God to work in the logic of your reasoning and to speak life where the enemy has haunted your family line for a long time with death. Invite life. The recreating God of salvation speaks and breathes life into our deepest disappointments. Be blessed.